McDougall Centre in Calgary, and I'm doing a Facebook Q&A for the next hour or so. Any questions you've got on any issues? Of course, I'm expecting a lot on Alberta's response to COVID-19 and all of those issues. Maybe just let me kick this off with some bad news and some good news. The sad news today is that Alberta has reported our highest ever number of COVID-related deaths since the pandemic began in March, with 38 people passing away from this disease yesterday. And I just want to extend condolences to all of the loved ones of over 1,300 people whose lives have been lost as a result of this disease. Having said that, there is also some good news right now, which is that we've made huge progress on Alberta's vaccination program. And we've now pushed past, I believe, 56,000 as of tonight. It might be higher than that. Vaccines done. We're basically running out of supply. I was just briefed that in certain areas we have run out of vaccines. The Government of Canada is responsible for the procurement because they were using the national purchasing power. Unfortunately, there are some indications that they were late to the table in terms of establishing contracts with pharmaceutical companies. Look, I'm not interested in getting into any kind of a finger pointing here. I just know this, that we are short of supply, and we're in a position now where we should be able to do at least 50,000 inoculations per week. And by the end of towards the end of March, we believe we can do upwards of 200,000 a week. In the regular flu influenza vaccine in the fall, we've done as many as 400,000 in a week. So that's the kind of logistical capacity. And I want to thank everyone in our healthcare system, particularly the folks at AHS who've been working on this vaccine program. It's really up and running. We are within days, in fact, within this week, I believe we will have inoculated on the first dose every Albertan living in a long-term care or designated supportive living environment. Remember, these are 2-dose vaccines, so this won't be fully effective for those elderly and frail people until they get their second dose in the next few weeks. But it is an important turning point in the fight against the virus. With that, I'm going to go straight to your questions. I've got Tracy Hanley. And by the way, people ask, how do we choose these? Because we get thousands of questions. I just asked the team here to pick a representative number of questions from different perspectives because often we'll get like 10 or maybe 100 or hundreds of questions on the same topic. We try to pick those questions that are representative of that. So I'll go to the first one. Tracy Hanley says, what number do we need to hit before we are released from our lockdown and are able to see our families again? Thank you, Tracy. First of all, let me just put the lockdown concept in context here. Alberta has never had a shelter-in-place or stay-at-home order, unlike most other places around the Western world, around Canada, the US, and Europe, for example. And in fact, in some provinces, well, at least in Quebec now, they have a curfew in place. So while I know that the ban on social gatherings is painful for many people, not being able to see their loved ones, it is the unfortunate reality here is that social transmission, when people get together to socialize, is by far the biggest reason for spread of this virus. And in terms of when we can, what number are we looking for? Well, we have a number of metrics, but one key metric we're looking for is to get the rate of transmission down to about 0.8%. Right now, it's at province-wide. We estimate an inferred rate of transmission of 0.9%. And basically that means that if 100 people get COVID, that they will pass it on to 90 other people. We need to get it down. And one of the reasons we need to get it down is because we still have huge pressure. We also need to see our hospital numbers come down. We still have over 800 folks hospitalized with COVID. And so it's all the key for us as a government has always been to minimize the broader healthcare impact of COVID, because for every patient who's in there with COVID, that is someone else's care we've had to postpone or cancel, someone's surgery that we've had to postpone. So we need to see those hospital numbers come down, and ICUs in particular. And I mean, we're at 130 in ICUs right now. we defined as our sort of tolerance limit 70. So we need to see further progress in reducing pressure on ICUs. We'd really like to see that rate of transmission come down another notch from 0.9 to 0.8. And frankly, one reason we need to be very careful about that is if we open up everything again, and the virus takes off like it did in the fall, where our active cases were doubling every 2 weeks, and hospitalizations went up by 500% in a month. If that happens, and we get hit by one of these new variants of the COVID-19 virus, like the one that is devastating Britain and Ireland right now, and if we hit that variant when we're at a very high level of transmission, it could be truly catastrophic. Instead of doubling every 2 weeks, we might be doubling every week or less than that. And that would pose a grave threat to the healthcare system. Unfortunately, I can't see the next question because the screen is on screensaver here. So I will, let me just say, yesterday we announced, while I'm waiting for the screen to come back up, that we expanded access to the vaccines in the priority group to paramedics. I want to thank paramedics for their patience and their input on that, which, we follow the advice of our scientific advisory committee on vaccines. And initially, they had not included paramedics in the key group of frontline healthcare workers, but we realized that many of those paramedics are actually involved in clinical interventions like intubation, which helps people who can't breathe because of COVID, and that can be very high risk to the paramedics. So we're happy to have included them. All right, I've got my screen back here. So I'll go now to Don Craik, who says, if the NHL can safely return, why can't minor sports return with restrictions in place? Thank you, Don. It's an absolutely fair question. And I think the answer is that we're following the advice of the chief medical officer, and the NHL has to comply with the public health orders in all of the different provinces and states where it operates. Here's the reality. We saw in the fall a large number of cases of widespread viral transmission coming from amateur sports, and in particular amateur hockey games. And that was taking off just because general community transmission was. On the other hand, as you know, we here in Alberta hosted the NHL playoffs and Stanley Cup finals in the fall, and there were, I think at the height of it, a couple of thousand people in that bubble in the ice district, and not a single case of transmission, even though there was very regular testing. So what's the difference? The difference is the scale of an operation like that, a total quarantine bubble, where people were being tested on almost a daily basis at the expense of the hockey teams, where no one was allowed to leave the quarantine zone for the entire, I think, 7 or 8 weeks of that whole playoff season. So you can't. There's no way that we could replicate that for amateur, let alone like semi-professional, like junior teams. There's no amateur sports activity where every player, every coach, every support person is going to quarantine themselves in a kind of a lockdown hotel zone attached to the ice rink, and they're going to get tested every single day. So there's just, I think, no comparable logistical structure where we could copy the approach with the resources and scale that's available to those professional sports franchises. I do hope that we can get back to relaxing restrictions on amateur sports. I understand the impact all this is having on the physical and mental health of young people in particular. But folks, please understand that if we were to just kind of open everything else up right now, even when Alberta we have the highest per capita level of daily deaths, the highest per capita level of hospitalizations, the highest per capita level of ICU admissions, and I believe we still have, the highest or second highest per capita level of new daily cases. So, and our total active cases have gone up a couple of days this week. The point is, we are not out of the woods yet. We are still feeling the pain of that huge spike of viral spread in the fall that was doubling every week, and doubling every 2 weeks. Pardon me, every 2 weeks. And if we I mean, I'm as impatient as anybody to lift restrictions, but if we do that now and we just go right back up that slope, as other provinces are seeing, we just end up having to slam on the brakes all over again, like other provinces are doing right now, and that hurts all of those organizations that have had to restart their activities, businesses that have reopened their doors, reordered inventory, rehired staff. If we end up back in exponential growth, pushing over 1,000 people in hospitals, and we have to slam on the brakes again, then that hurts all of those organizations doubly. So we simply have to be careful about this. We have to just stick to our knitting and get those numbers down. So hopefully we can gradually, prudently relax restrictions. All right, Samantha Summer says, when do we expect regular folks to begin getting vaccinated? Probably, I would say around May, June. Samantha, when you say regular folks, I think you mean people who are healthy, don't have chronic health conditions, and are more in the average or younger age groups. So right now we're focused on the priority group 1A, which is frontline healthcare workers involved in COVID, like ICU nurses, respiratory therapists, doctors working in ICU. Obviously, we've added paramedics, also people working in long-term care nursing homes, and the population living in those homes. Next, we're going to open up, perhaps next week, vaccinations to be booked for anybody over 75 in the general population, and then we'll start moving down that age bracket gradually. And based on our current projections of vaccine supply, we should be able to open it up to sort of the general population in the summer around June, but it all depends on how much supply that we get, or that the federal government gets for us, I should say. Glenda Dufresne, pardon me, says, not a COVID question, good. When is oil and gas getting back to work? Well, some good news there, Glenda. We have seen a real recovery in prices over the past few weeks, and today in particular, Paul, if you could just hand me my phone there. Today in particular, I think we saw WTI trading at $53. I've got this little app here which tells me this stuff. And WCS, Western Canadian Select prices, were at right here. Yeah, WTI was at $54, and WCS, which is kind of the price for heavy Alberta crude, was $39. That's the highest it's been since February. So that's good news. We've also seen a significant uptick in drilling activity, and the oil sands are producing more than they ever have in their history. When this spring we thought that we were looking at a potential oil-mageddon in the patch because of the Saudi-Russian price war. So we've gotten past that. Other good news, global demand continues to grow. Gas prices are also way up. I think the AECO price, which is the standard Alberta price for gas, is at about $2.60, $2.70 right now. LNG prices are skyrocketing because of a cold winter in Asia. And I have a tip that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers will be issuing its annual projection for capital spending in the patch tomorrow, which is actually somewhat optimistic, or it's a good report. So we will begin to see some recovery in capital spending, and that's the key thing to get people back to work. So knock on wood, it looks like we've certainly got some green shoots, and it looks like there will be some return of investment activity, job creation, and hopefully this price situation continues. All right, Kate Blackmore says, can we expect bigger lockdowns like Quebec and Ontario? Small businesses need to operate. The economy cannot collapse. Yes, Kate, I totally agree and hear what you're saying. And the answer is no. We don't need to go to the extremes, places like Quebec and Ontario, many U.S. states and European countries, if we continue with the current progress, with the current policy setting. And let me say, I know how painful this is for personal services businesses, for events-style businesses, for hospitality, restaurants, for example. Having said that, about 95% of businesses in Alberta are able legally to operate right now with COVID-safe guidelines, which is higher than virtually all the provinces. I think Saskatchewan is right now, slightly less restrictive approaches on businesses, but not much different than us. Ontario and Quebec have gone to the kind of hard lockdown model right now. We must avoid that at all costs, and the way to do so is for all of us to continue to be careful, follow the guidelines and rules, and we will get there. Todd Valentine says, hi, Mr. Premier, will there be more financial help for small businesses since the lockdown went longer than anticipated? Todd, we did expand the small business relaunch grant from a maximum of $5,000 to $20,000. I would ask our team to please put a link in the comments section below on how people can get more information on that grant. As well, the federal government, with our support, has expanded and made more, less red tape around their commercial rent assistance program, and the wage subsidy program has also been renewed. So there is a lot of support. I know that's cold comfort for businesses that have zero money coming in right now, but if we need to expand that financial support even further, we will do so. Connie Marie Layton says, how is it going on stopping the carbon tax? I hear Quebec doesn't have a carbon tax. Yeah, Connie, they don't. That's a very good point. Quebec has a so-called cap and trade scheme, which is a really complicated system. But basically, the real price of that's passed on to people through their cap and trade is about $20 a ton. We're now at $40 a ton. And of course, the federal Liberals have announced that's going to go to $170 a ton, just like I predicted. Where is our fight at? Well, we won our constitutional challenge of the federal carbon tax at the Alberta Appeal Court in February on a 4-1 vote, where they declared that it was a, quote, constitutional Trojan horse, unquote, and a huge violation of our provincial jurisdiction. That is now on appeal, together with decisions from the Saskatchewan and Ontario Courts of Appeal at the Supreme Court of Canada. Oral arguments were heard in September. We expect a written judgment from the Supreme Court in March. And depending on how that goes, we'll have to assess our next steps. Bonnie Porachnavi says, why do people who got the vaccine still have to wear a mask? Okay, Bonnie, first of all, the vaccine is a two-dose thing. It's separated by 3 or 4 weeks between the 2 doses, so it's not fully effective until the second dose. So nobody in Alberta has yet received their second dose. We may start second doses late next week. Secondly, we do not yet know scientifically whether this vaccine prevents or diminishes infectiousness. We do know, based on huge trials involving tens of thousands of people, and now widespread application of the vaccine around the world, that it radically reduces the chances of people becoming symptomatic. But whether it reduces their chances of being infectious, we do not yet know. Bonnie, just earlier today, I had about a 40-minute phone conversation with my friend Yuli Edelstein, who is the Minister of Health in Israel. And I called him, my friend Yuli, I've known for 25 years because he's been leading the world's most successful vaccine program. They vaccinated over 2 million Israelis out of a population of 8 million, a quarter of their population. That would be like here in Alberta, us having vaccinated 1 million, but we've only vaccinated 55,000. So they've done an amazing job leading the world. And I said, how's it going, Yuli? He said, well, we're going in 2 gears. He said, on the one hand, we're doing amazing on the vaccines, but on the other hand, we had our worst day in the history of the pandemic in 10 months with new cases today. He said part of the problem is because of widespread vaccination, a lot of people think it's over, they can go out, they can go back to their normal lives. And he said, basically he said that new cases are taking off like wildfire. So that is, Bonnie, why we need to continue to be cautious, and will have to be for some time to come. Sharon Elliott says, when do you think the 65 plus seniors with higher risk health issues will be getting COVID-19 vaccines? So Sharon, we'll probably be starting with the 75 plus population next week in the general population, the general community, because those are the people most at risk. As you probably know, The average age of COVID fatalities in Alberta is 82, 83. And so the people over 75 are most at risk. So we'll start with them. And I think, I'll probably be corrected on this, but from memory, it's about 200,000 people in that group. And that will probably take us a few weeks to get through that, probably about a month until we've completed the 75 plus population. Then we'll move it down to people in the age of either over 60 or 65. So that will probably start about a month from now. Don't hold me exactly to that, but I'm giving you a guesstimate that we'll be able to move to people over 65 at some point in February, probably mid-February, give or take, and then keep moving it down from there. All right, Susan Livingston-Fank says, is progress being made on Alberta procuring our own vaccine independent of the federal government? So, Susan, we're in a very preliminary stage on that. Let me say that I understand there are at least 15 different vaccines under development around the world. 3 of them have completed phase 3 trials and are now subject to widespread production and use. Those would be Pfizer and Moderna that we're using here in Canada, and AstraZeneca, part of the Oxford research group. And they've been approved for use and are being used in the United Kingdom. They're pending approvals from Health Canada. The government of the 15 or so vaccine programs that I know of, I believe the federal government signed exclusive rights for the Canadian market with about 8 or 9 of them. And that includes Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and a bunch of others. So we have no legal access to our own separate purchasing arrangements with those 8 or 9 that the feds have exclusive contractual arrangements with. But what I've asked our folks here to do, our technical people, is to see whether there are any of the other vaccines that the feds have not contracted with that we potentially could go to directly. Now, let me be clear. A province with 4.5 million people is not going to have the same purchasing power to get priority access in production for any vaccine versus huge jurisdictions. We have, the countries around the world, US 330 million, China, India, billion plus. And so obviously a small jurisdiction like Alberta is not going to have a lot of purchasing power, ability to get far up the queue. So I don't want to hold out false promise, but we will explore that to see if maybe there are some producers that the feds don't have arrangements with that we could get at least some vaccines as we go through later in the year. Jeremy Patfield says, when are you getting rid of photoradar, also the recall legislation? Thanks, Jeremy. So on photoradar, good question. What we did when we came into office is we implemented new restrictions that limit how municipalities can use it, basically to stop the speed trap, cash cow approach to photoradar, and to focus it more on public safety in areas like school zones and parks. And we're going to analyze the data from those changes to see if municipalities have complied with our policy direction. If there is evidence that they're still using it as a cash grab as opposed to as a safety measure, then we may have to act further to restrict this. So stay tuned on that. On the issue of recall, legislation will be passed in this upcoming winter-spring 2021 session of the legislature to bring in a recall law. We've kept our platform commitment to ask a legislature committee to consult with Albertans on how best to design a recall law. For those of you who don't know, recall is where if a certain percentage of constituents or voters sign a petition, they can force a by-election for, let's say, an MLA or a city councillor, municipal councillor. And so the committee, the Democratic Reform Committee of the legislature, completed its study on both recall and citizens-initiated referenda. They did that in December. The report is now has come to the government, and our lawyers are drafting a bill for consideration by cabinet, and that will be introduced and passed in sometime. We're expecting the ledge will come back in February, So it'll be sometime, probably March, April, that legislation will pass. Sean Foley, what are your thoughts on Build Back Better and the Great Reset? Yeah, I think Build Back Better just sounds to me like a meaningless slogan that a bunch of politicians and political campaigns have adopted. I don't think there's much behind that, to my knowledge. But the Great Reset is a very definite program, a set of ideas first proposed by Klaus Schwab, who is the founder of the World Economic Forum, also known as the Davos Summit in Switzerland, which I describe as one of the world's greatest exercises in hypocrisy, where billionaires, millionaires, and Hollywood stars and so forth from around the world gather, and they seem to, I mean, 25 years ago, it seemed to start as something focused on sharing thoughts on economic policy, but increasingly it's become about promoting failed ideas about centralized planning, socialism, redistributive policies, more powerful government, and all of that. And that's how I would summarize Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset. I haven't read it, but I've read summaries of it. He sent me a copy of it, as I've mentioned before. I guess he sent one to every government leader around the world. But what I find really offensive about this whole Great Reset idea is that it is explicitly, the advocates of it are trying to exploit the COVID crisis to advance their political agenda. And I just find that, frankly, disgusting. To say, look at all this human misery, this loss of life, this huge economic destruction, this enormous traumatic impact on the lives of countless people. Let's exploit that to drive forward an agenda that we normally would not get democratic consent for. That is totally outrageous, and I completely oppose that. If those folks want to promote their failed socialist ideas, then they should do so as part of the normal democratic decision-making process, not trying to exploit a tragic crisis like this. So that's my take on the Great Reset. All right, Kevin Wog says, Mr. Premier, why are prisoners being vaccinated before frontline workers? Please explain. So Kevin, that is not a provincial thing. I want to be clear about that. That is the government of Canada with the federal, Corrections Canada, the federal penitentiaries, and they've decided to vaccinate a certain percentage of their prison population. Now, Kevin, as you know, I rarely miss an opportunity to criticize the federal government where I think their policies are off base. And if they were, in fact, taking vaccines away from frontline workers or the elderly, frail population, I would be all over them about that. But what I understand is that they've set aside 600 doses to deal with very elderly, frail prisoners. There's not a lot of them, but they have some prisoners in their 70s and 80s. That seems to me humane and ethical, that they should, like anybody in their 70s or 80s, be able to get access to the vaccine early on, given their particular vulnerability. But I'm told that this is not for the general prison population, not for the healthy younger prisoners, and I would go to the wall to oppose any effort to redirect vaccines from frontline workers or the elderly, frail to healthy younger prisoners. That would not be ethical. 1 second, please, folks. Tanya Resch asks, what are the current stats on transmission? Where is transmission happening? Thanks, Tanya. So the answer is that in the fall spike, with so many new cases, where we were doubling cases every 2 weeks, we lost the ability to trace them. Now, two things have happened. So what we saw then was what we call just general community transmission. But we've always known that social interaction is and at-home transmission is the #1 vector of transmission, as they say. So, and we believe that continues to be the case. So it might be somebody picking it up at work or out in the general community. They bring it home. People at home get sick. And that is why we've brought in a much more generous support for people who maybe live in crowded homes, maybe a large intergenerational family, maybe there's a bunch of people sharing only one or two washrooms, and they can't really properly socially distance. We're offering for those people to get 2 weeks of free access to a hotel. We've got these COVID isolation hotel supports, and we're also providing them with some, I think it's $650 payments if they complete that 2-week self-isolation period because they can't do it at home. So home transmission, social transmission will continue to be the leading factor. I do have some other good news though. We continue to expand our contact tracing workforce, and we're now, well, the other day we completed 900 cases that were traced, and so we're now doing 800 to 900 cases a day. And so we're back on top of that, so we'll have much more reliable statistics about the specific sources of transmission. All right, Rana Damak says, Ron, pardon me, says, what's the war room working on in regards to promoting the Canadian energy sector? Well, actually, I would just ask our team to please put a link below that can take you to the Canadian Energy Center. And Ron, when the pandemic started in March, April, we cut their budget by 90%, because most of the budget for the Canadian Energy Centre has been there to support advertising outside of Alberta to explain to other Canadians and in some parts of the world the importance of secure energy and our environmental performance, all of that. So part of that it was mainly like a big advertising budget. So they're down to a $3 million budget, and they're using that. Yes, they are planning big advocacy and advertising campaigns when the time is right, but right now a lot of the work is being done is really good research. I know they've done a recent study on Indigenous First Nations partnership in the oil and gas sector, employment of First Nations, environmental progress here in Alberta, the reduction in carbon emissions. We've also worked, I'm not sure if the Energy Centre was involved in this directly, but I'm pleased to tell you that a consortium of researchers, including those at Stanford University, have come up with a new baseline study of the carbon intensity of the Canadian oil sands, which shows that we are much lower than originally we were believed. A lot of the criticism of the environmental performance, the GHG and carbon emissions from the Alberta oil sands was based on very out-of-date and flawed analysis. And so this new Stanford study, in fact, I'd ask our team, if you just Google, you'll be able to find this. I think there was an article, an op-ed in the National Post about it. Let's put a link on there as well, because I think it's interesting reading. And that's the kind of research that we need to take to global financial markets that are under increasing pressure for the so-called environmental social governance criteria for investing. We need to present them with the real data showing that the carbon intensity of a barrel of Alberta bitumen is lower than the average barrel of heavy oil produced around the world, and certainly much lower than the average barrel of heavy produced in the US. All right, Judy Clement has a question. What's the verdict on the gun regulations? So, Judy, no verdict yet. There are, I think, several legal challenges that have been brought by firearms owners, and none of them have gone to trial yet, let alone a judgment. So we're going to wait for that, and we may, depending on how those cases go, we may actually intervene in support of some of those cases on appeal. Don't want to bore you with the technical legal stuff here, but typically governments only intervene on constitutional issues at appeal if they're brought by a third party. But we will be moving forward early in this new year with the appointment of an Alberta Chief Firearms Officer. And if you're interested in these issues, I'd ask you to perhaps contact Michaela Glasgow, the MLA for Brooks Medicine Hat, if our team could put her contact information below. Michaela is chairing the Alberta Advisory Committee on the firearms regulation to get advice from the community about how most effectively Alberta can fight the federal regulatory overreach, trying to really harass through regulation law-abiding firearms owners. And what really ticks me off is they don't place nearly as much emphasis on the importation of illegal guns by gangs from the United States across the Canadian border. We know that's where the vast majority of firearms used in the commission of crimes come from. And so instead of harassing duck hunters in Alberta, how about focusing on the gangs, many of them in central Canada, that are bringing these guns across the border? Brenda Hepner-Webb asks, why did the cop in Calgary get to have a big funeral, but my grandfather's can't have more than 10 people in person? And Brenda's grandfather was a war vet. Thank you, first of all, Brenda, to your grandfather posthumously for his service to our country in the war, and my condolences to you and your family on your loss. The sergeant of the Calgary Police Service was also a veteran. He also served in the Canadian Military Police. And there is a process where people can, for exceptional reasons, apply for a larger maximum of people to attend a funeral. They can do that with the Chief Medical Officer of Health. That's what the Calgary Police Service did, and that was approved by Dr. Hinshaw. My understanding is that they had, in order to provide for a regimental police funeral, there are several people involved in that. That plus the family could not be contained. It was a very, very large church, and I think they had fewer than 50 people. In terms of the outdoor element, and I participated in that to represent Alberta's government, people were spaced out 8 feet between each other, so more than 2 meters, outside wearing masks. There was no personal greeting or physical contact permitted, so all of the public health rules and guidelines were carefully followed by the police and other mourners with respect to the outdoor tribute. And of course, it was Sergeant Andrew Harnett, and let me say condolences to his partner. She has and Andrew, we're expecting, it's very, very sad. And I just want to say that a tribute to the police, because every time they put on that uniform and go out on a patrol, on an assignment, they don't know if that could be their last day, and we owe them all a huge debt of gratitude. And quite frankly, I think it's appropriate that we recognize in a special way those who lose their lives in the defense of all of us. Tina Hoffer says, can you pay to get a vaccination sooner if you want? Well, not in Alberta, Tina, because the government controls all of the supply, but that may be the case in the States. I do know of some Canadian snowbirds down in Florida who have gotten the vaccine where they would not yet get it in Ontario, but that's because there's a lot more supply. But no, you can't purchase it here in Canada. I don't see that happening. I mean, it would have to be private health companies getting their own access to vaccines, and I just don't see how they will do that given the huge scramble and the purchasing power of large governments. I hope that got that right, Like Patterson says, will Alberta government workers give up their paychecks too? Well, I've said, the answer is no. That I've said that one of the things that is deeply unfair about COVID is that, frankly, many of the people calling for the most restrictive measures have had the security of a guaranteed paycheck and have not had to face the financial adversity of losing their income. And there is a deep unfairness in that. So I get the point of your question. I will tell you this, I took a 10% voluntary pay cut in 2019, and all the MLAs took a 5% pay cut. That's on top of earlier pay cuts of 5%. So my job is paid 15% less. That is, I would hope, symbolic leadership. And I hope it's seen that way, and political staff have also taken a 7% cut. And you know that there have been, Mr. Patterson, there have been reductions in the size of the public service as we have been trying to get our province's finances in order. And we are going into collective bargaining with all of the government unions. And our position is that those folks who benefit from very strong job security, plus benefits that are generally not available in the private sector, and who have not faced the huge decline in incomes over the past 5 years, and particularly during COVID, that those folks need to show that they're part of this, and that will be our position as we go into collective bargaining. All right, Heather Bishop says, Why won't you leave teachers' pensions in the ATRF instead of seizing their pensions against their wishes? Heather, I'm sorry, I'm smiling because there's been no such seizure. That is just completely false. And in fact, the ATRF is the Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund, still exists. That has not changed. What has happened is that the administration of the pension funds has moved from a separate investment team at ATRF to the common investment team at AIMCO, the Alberta Investment Management Corporation, which has been investing public sector pensions for all of the other government workers since its inception over a decade ago. So this was simply about consolidating the administration of the investment of that money. The government has not seized the money. That is ridiculous. In fact, the government contributes. Half of the money, the taxpayer contributes. Let's be clear, it's the taxpayer that puts in half of the funds into the ATRF. And it's ultimately, Heather, the taxpayer who's on the hook if the ATRF does poorly in terms of its investment returns. Let me back up a step, because a lot of folks who ask those questions, I think, may have a basic misunderstanding about the nature of the ATRF and public pensions. There's two kinds of pensions, all right? There's defined contribution and defined benefit pensions. Defined contribution pensions are much more common in the private sector. Most people in the private sector don't have pensions at all, but those that do typically have a defined contribution pension. That's where the employee and the employer put in matching dollars into an annuity, and then that annuity is invested, sometimes directly by the employee, sometimes by the company that runs or contracts out the investment. But the returns you get back on a defined contribution pension are only the returns of the principal plus whatever investment income has been generated over time. Whereas a defined benefit pension, that's what you have with the ATRF, okay? And almost all government pensions, MLAs don't have one, but almost all government pensions are defined benefit. And defined benefit means that you get a matching contribution, employer-employee, then it's invested. But regardless of what the returns on those investments are, regardless, the returns could be negative. There is a benefit formula that dictates the pension payout when people are eligible to become beneficiaries. The ATRF is a defined benefit plan. And what does that mean, Heather? It means that even if the ATRF goes into negative returns, even if it loses money year after year, God forbid, the taxpayer is on the hook as the guarantor of that defined benefit pension to make up the unfunded liability and to pay out the defined benefits based on the formula. So this notion that the funds have been seized or taken is frankly just a huge myth. It's ridiculous. At the end of the day, the taxpayer is if you're a teacher, is guaranteeing your pension based on the fixed formula. And quite frankly, people who work in the government should be, I think, very grateful that they have that certainty, that they have the taxpayers guaranteeing what most people in the private sector couldn't dream of. So why did we shift this administration of the investment from ATRF to AIMCO, which is also a government entity, to reduce duplication? And this is allowing us to reduce the premiums, to save $20 million for the teachers and $20 million per year for the taxpayers by having one more efficient, consolidated investment administration. The governance stays the same, by the way. I believe it's the Alberta Teachers Association nominates half, or is it slightly more than half of the directors to the board of the ATRF. So there continues to be governance accountability to the participants in that pension, to the retired teachers, and that board gets to direct AIMCO on the investment strategy. So they get to say on behalf of the teachers, what level of risk they're prepared to take, the level of diversification in those investments, the level of returns that they would like to see, et cetera. So the governance maintains accountability to teachers. The benefits are vested with the teachers, regardless of who is investing it. I'm sorry that I went at too long on that, but I've heard a lot of misunderstanding about that. So I just want to be absolutely clear. Those are guaranteed and defined benefit pensions. All right, Rita Nichols says, when will hairstylists be going back to work? Thank you, Rita. I really hope that when we get to relaxing the public health restrictions, that we can do so for businesses in the personal services industry. That would include hairstylists. I know how painful this has been. I know that most hair salons, barbershops are small, owner operated, and that's the only source of income people have. And I'm so regretful that those businesses have been suspended now the second time this year. I also want to say thank you to the hairstylists, estheticians, and others in the personal services for having been so careful when they were open and operating in a COVID-safe way between May and December. Unfortunately, we reached a point where there was such widespread community transmission with a doubling of cases every 2 weeks and a 500% increase in COVID hospitalizations that we had to bring in these measures just to reduce general community contact. Our cabinet will be taking, or I should say our cabinet COVID committee will be taking a close look at the most recent data in the next couple of weeks with the advice of Dr. Hinshaw to see what is the responsible pace for reopening for hairstylists and other businesses. All right, Janessa, 1 second, please. What is the current status of contact tracing in Alberta? What percentage of cases are they tracing? Very good question, Janessa. We've really ramped it up. So I mentioned this in response to an earlier question. We are now completing contact tracing on between 800 and 900 cases a day. And that's pretty much where we're at in terms of new cases. So we're staying on top of the new cases, which is really important for two reasons. We've ramped up our capacity while the number of new cases has come down as the result of those restrictions. We will continue to ramp it up. AHS's current goal, I believe, is to be able to do 1,300 by the end, daily cases traced by the end of March. But I must tell you, I'm pushing them every day, every week to accelerate that. I've made it clear that there's really basically no budget limitation on this. They have the resources they need. I think that the main limitation, the reason why, frankly, the contact tracing workforce has not grown as quickly as I have asked is because a certain number of the contact tracers have to be regulated medical personnel, like nurses. Some of this work that is done by contact tracers is medically sensitive, and they do need at least some degree of close supervision by medical personnel. And obviously, we have people working long shifts in hospitals. There's not a great surplus of medical personnel available right now. So there has been that constraint, but we continue to move up the number of contact tracers, and we are now able to stay on top of new cases. Pearl Varstra says, I heard you on Danielle Smith this morning. Thank you for that. I'm sad to see her go, as am I. What do you say about her feelings on how there is a movement to shut down the Conservative voice? Yeah, Pearl, well, that does concern me. I mean, just growing attacks on freedom of expression in general concern me. One of the core characteristics and values of a democracy, of a pluralistic society, is freedom of speech. We hear people, we hear a lot of politicians and clever people talk endlessly about how diversity is our greatest strength. Well, if diversity is meaningful, it must mean diversity of thought, diversity of opinion. The very first words in the Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the very first fundamental freedoms enumerated are freedom of conscience and religion. You can go back to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. 1948, I believe, and it talks at length about the importance of freedom of opinion, freedom of political opinion, freedom of conscience and thought and belief. These are foundational freedoms, and I see them increasingly being under attack through things like so-called cancel culture, where if you express or at any point in your life have expressed an opinion that is now deemed to be politically incorrect, you are subject to widespread attacks, ridicule, threats, job loss, economic attacks. So I'm deeply concerned, and I think that's kind of what Danielle has been getting at. She has said that there are many subjects that she's not been able to raise, frankly, on her platform. I don't know what exactly is going on there, whether that has to do with her employer or just the general media environment, but that is very concerning. And my general impression is that there has been a shrinking space for acceptable public discourse. She quoted in her statement on this a really good book that I recommend to people by a self-described liberal Democrat sociologist in the United States named Jonathan Haidt. And it is a study on basically the importance of respectful discourse with a diversity of opinion in a free and democratic society. And that's something we desperately need. One thing our government did was that we required universities and colleges to publish a free speech policy to protect free speech where perhaps it is most important on campuses. All right, Pierre Asselin says, non-COVID question, who is going to win the Battle of Alberta this year? I see Pierre is an Oilers fan. I'm smart enough not to tangle with you on that, Pierre. But I just wish, let's hope that we're past COVID when the next playoffs are played. I said to Gary Bettman, he called me to thank Alberta for having hosted the playoffs in Edmonton in the bubble. And I said, Gary, it was just a bit embarrassing that you couldn't even get the home team into the playoffs. The next time we're going to drive a harder bargain to see that the Oilers or the Flames get into the playoffs. So let's hope. I'm always rooting for Team Alberta. Cindy Adele says, please stop cuts in healthcare and teachers. Thanks, Cindy. There are no cuts in healthcare or teachers. That's not just an opinion; it's a fact. And I would invite our staff here to. I know we have some infographics on that. The truth is, Cindy, that we are spending more on healthcare than in the history of Alberta. Alberta spends more per person on healthcare than any province in Canada. Canada spends more on healthcare as a share of its economy than almost any publicly administered single-payer system in the world, which basically means that Alberta has one of the most expensive publicly administered systems. We are spending more than the previous government did, more than any government did, particularly and obviously in this COVID year. We'll probably be spending at least $1.5 billion more than was budgeted. So the budget will easily be over $21 billion this year. So no, there have been no healthcare cuts, Cindy. We are trying to find greater efficiencies because we can't continue we can't continue with $20 billion deficits forever. Who's going to pay for that, Cindy? The future generations plus interest with higher taxes that diminishes their economic chances. That's not fair. It's not moral to do that. And I don't think Albertans are in a position where we can dig deeper into their pockets right now with higher taxes on everybody. And we're not going to drive businesses out of our province even more than the previous government did by hiking taxes on the job creators when the private sector has already been through so much pain and sacrifice. So Cindy, that segment, that $22 billion, we've got to ask our folks in the whole system to operate more efficiently. And part of that is compensation, which is why, for example, we asked the physicians to work with us to stop the average annual increase in physician compensation of 6% per year, year after year after year, when the private sector has seen its incomes shrink. We have the best paid physicians in the country. We have the best healthcare benefits for healthcare workers. We need to find ways of achieving efficiencies in the system, but every dollar in efficiencies that are realized would be reinvested back in the system. And the same applies in education. The education budget is up, not a huge amount. I think it's like $200 or $300 million up, but the per pupil grants are up as well. But we have to ask the folks, like, the schools have not been faced by the same economic devastation that the private sector has. And surely with one of the most expensive healthcare system or education systems in the country, school boards and teachers and can find more efficient ways of operating. I think that's an entirely reasonable expectation. But there have been no cuts, and that's not an opinion. You can go to the budget stats, figures, and look at that yourself. All right, Tracy Hanley, says, what number do we need to hit before we are released? I actually already answered that. Caitlin Polsky says, why is it that students are allowed in a classroom of 30 where distancing isn't possible, but we aren't allowed to have a small cohort? Okay, thanks. It's a good question, Caitlin. I'll kind of channel Dr. Hinshaw here because I've heard her answer this before. The difference, there are a number of differences. One is that a classroom is a very structured environment. You have a chain of accountability, teachers, principals, etc., who are in charge of ensuring careful compliance with the public health restrictions. And in the case of schools, that means mask wearing. Particular, the provincial requirement is mask wearing in common areas where students might be close to one another. No socializing amongst the students, being spread out as much as they can, facing away from one another. And of course, there's a symptom screen every morning when people come in to the school. There are action plans to deal with cases that might be introduced very quickly into the schools, and all of that. So that's a very structured environment with multiple layers of protection. But if you get together with your friends around, I know a friend of a friend caught COVID and brought it to his workplace because he'd been playing poker in his basement with his friends back in the fall. Well, imagine a few guys around a table sharing chips and dip and laughing, and they're all right next to each other. They're not wearing masks. That is you've probably seen our Mr. COVID ads. That's the point of those ads. It's that, who is sitting 2 meters apart from one another, or even a meter apart from one another around the dining room table wearing a mask, having done a temperature check on the way in, having done a symptom check on the way in. That is just not how people socialize. So, and what we know from the schools that were operating if we're in classroom instruction from August, September through to December is that there were very few cases of transmission. I believe it was 0.4% of students or teachers, of the 720,000 students or teachers became COVID positive in that period of time. It's also true that younger people are at lower risk of transmission and at much, much lower risk of becoming symptomatic or having serious health consequences. All right, Sean Gruel says, and one other point, and I think there's almost a unanimous view that supports this. The in-classroom instruction is critically important for the social, mental, and emotional development and health of children. Cutting kids off for months at a time from any peer interaction, from any social interaction, from in-person instruction, trying to get little kids, 6 and 7-year-olds, to learn for months online, all of that will damage their life chances and cause lots of other problems. Us grown-ups, we are more resilient. It's a real sacrifice to ask people not to interact socially, for sure. I feel that myself, but it is much easier for us to make that sacrifice than ask little children to do that by cutting them off completely from in-person learning. And that's why, right across the world, governments have prioritized in-classroom learning within the context of COVID restrictions. Sean Gruel says, what happens if Trudeau calls an election? How will that affect the oil and gas industry? Well, Sean, I think it would be inexcusable for a government that to unnecessarily call an election. Now, in the case of BC and Saskatchewan, they'd come up to their 4-year limits, so they were required by convention, more or less by the Constitution, to call elections. But they could have delayed them, but it would still, they would have been forced to do them in the COVID period. But the federal government doesn't have that excuse. This is actually a stable government because you have the Liberals being supported by the NDP, so it's a stable minority. So I don't see any rationale why the Prime Minister would dissolve Parliament and have an election in the middle of this huge pandemic when we should be all focused on job number one, which is vaccinating people, protecting lives and livelihoods. What impact would it have on oil and gas? I don't know, Sean. I mean, the last one we saw the Prime Minister openly campaign against the oil and gas sector. I think it would just further inflame things if that were to happen all over again. All right. Marcel Van says, how are we doing on the abandoned oil wells? Thanks, Marcel. Yeah, we launched not a campaign, pardon me, but a program in the spring, and I want to credit where it's due. The feds helped us out with $1 billion in funding. It's to accelerate completion, remediation of abandoned and incomplete wells, which obviously represent a big and general environmental liability out there. But the idea was, if we could help accelerate that, we get some of the small service companies back to work. Some of those great blue-collar oil field service people could get to work. And so we cut that up into 10 tranches, each $100 million. And I think we're now moving from tranche 4 to tranche 5. So about half of that money has been expended. Hundreds of wells have been reclaimed. Maybe it may be in the thousands. And I'll tell you what, next time I do this, I'll bring an update because it's been a while since I've had a briefing. But it is creating thousands of jobs, and I think it's a very good program. All right, 1 second, please. Cindy Walensky says, talk about the open pit coal mines you are allowing in the southern foothills that will poison our waterways. Well, so Cindy, first of all, there have been coal mines operating in the Crow's Nest Pass region and along the various parts of the eastern slopes of the Alberta Rockies for about 140 years, continuously. So there are pending applications for potentially new mine operations that would have to go through the very rigorous federal and or provincial environmental assessment process to ensure, and if any of those mines actually did represent a risk to the waterways, they would obviously be vetoed. They would only be approved under Alberta and Canadian environmental law if they did not pose an environmental risk to our waterways, for example. So your question implied that the government's approved of new mines. It has not done so. Government has opened has a policy that is willing to consider new investment. And why, Cindy? Because we desperately need to create jobs, and our history as a province, as a country, has been doing so through responsible resource development. I know there are some city folks, and I'm a city guy, who sit there and say we should shut down all these so-called dirty resource industries. Gosh knows there's a lot of them, of the world, who want to shut down oil and gas and mining and all of it. But you know, these are industries that millions of people rely on to put food on the table. All of the teachers and the nurses, all of the public sector folks, the money that they are paid does not come from, is not invented out of thin air. It's not just printed by the government. It's wealth that is taxed from the private sector, and in this province, disproportionately from the resource industries and the people that work in it, responsibly, as they've done in mining, yes, including coal mining, for the entire history of our province's economy. So high environmental standards, Indigenous consultation. I do know, for example, Cindy, that the biggest proponents I know of in the province for the development of new coal mines in the Crozes Pass region is the Piikani First Nation, because apparently they have a joint venture with potential project mining companies, and they are desperate to have this opportunity at responsible resource development, at employment for their local people, spin-off economic opportunities, revenue that would flow from this. And so, Cindy, our view is that we should not bar that or other First Nations from the opportunity of prosperity, of employment, of the dignity of work, of progress, of economic progress, and the social progress that goes along with it. So we will respect our very strong environmental laws with any forthcoming applications. But as I say, there have been mines operating. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're getting emails from some environmental group that's trying to get you to send them money, and maybe they're lying about this like they did about us selling off supposedly all the parks. Not a single park has been sold. It was just a campaign of lies. So I would just say stay tuned for more lies from these organizations that need to scare people in order to raise money to pay their fat salaries, when in fact the reality is this government will never apologize for standing up for working women and men in our resource industries. And one last point about the prospective coal mine applications for new development down there is that we're talking here about metallurgical and not thermal coal. Thermal coal is what supports power plants, basically, and it is a higher sulfur content, higher emitting, higher CO2 emitting form of coal. Whereas metallurgical coal is necessary for steel making. So Cindy, if you ever get in a car, walk into a modern building with a steel structure, if you ever get on an airplane, if you ever use, basically, unless you're living in a mud hut, metaphorically speaking, if you are part of the modern economy, then you depend on steel. And steel depends on metallurgical coal. And that coal has to be developed from somewhere. And if it's not developed in Alberta, it will be developed in Australia, it will be developed in China. I'd like to, if we can develop it here in an environmentally responsible way, create jobs, wealth, tax revenue, opportunity for First Nations, I think we should be open to it in an environmentally responsible way. Sorry, I went on too long, I apologize. Raymond Dariwal says, do we still have to quarantine after coming cross borders, even if you've tested negative? Yes, Raymond. So I think what you're referring to is the new federal policy that was instituted last week, which requires that people traveling to Canada show proof of a recent negative COVID-19 test. So that is for being able to board a flight or enter into the country, like at a land border crossing. But once you're here, you're still completely under the 14-day self-isolation quarantine requirement, with one exception. If you go into the Alberta Travel Pilot Program, which applies for international passengers arriving at Calgary Airport or the Coots border crossing between Montana and Alberta. If you enroll in that program, you take a test upon arrival. You should get the results back in 2 days. If it's negative, you're then free to leave isolation pending the results of a second test that's taken 7 days later. So that's the only way to shorten but not eliminate the quarantine requirement. All right, Jared Isaac says, where are we on the transfer payment referendum? Okay, Jared, so we will be holding a referendum on equalization this fall at the same time as the municipal elections, and more details to follow. And that's what we promised to Albertans in the last election. Cindy Ferguson Haskell says, what's your prediction for the Alberta economy in the next couple of years? Actually, Cindy, maybe I'm just an inveterate optimist, as they say, but I am optimistic. Tough months, there's no doubt about it. But we are seeing some real signs of hope. We saw in 2020 the best year for venture capital. That's the kind of investment that gets startups in the tech sector going. Best year ever in Alberta history. And We are, as I mentioned earlier, seeing some really strong signs in the energy sector. I believe we'll be seeing a projection tomorrow about increased capital investment, which will create jobs. Energy prices are recovering. We're producing more oil in the oil sands than ever in our history. We are in discussions with a number of companies about moving significant numbers of jobs and potentially even corporate headquarters here to Calgary. We're not going to land all of them, but I believe we will land some. And naturally, when we come out of COVID, with a critical mass of people getting vaccinated here and around the world in the summer, moving towards the fall, we're going to see, I think, very strong recovery. There's a lot of pent-up cash out there, people that haven't been spending, and they've got that more disposable income that's pent up. Investment decisions are going to be unleashed, and we're doing Alberta's recovery plan to make this province once again a magnet for that new investment. I'm just going to take maybe 3 or 4 more questions because we've been at this for over an hour, and I think I've taken 31 questions. So Kate Adams says, can you commit to providing more money for ALERT and ACERT? We have actually, Kate. That was in our platform, and I don't have the number in front of me, but ALERT, for those of you who don't know, is the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team, and ACERT, I believe, deals specifically, is part of ALERT. They deal with cases, crimes involving like sexual exploitation of the vulnerable, things like human trafficking. So we have increased the budget for ALERT and ACERT to do exactly that. I think we'll look it up in the platform and provide you with the answer. Mandy Oshner says, what is your limit when it comes to government overreach? I really want to know, are we on the same path as other provinces in Canada? Well, Mandy, I'm not sure if you mean COVID or non-COVID, but look, I mean, obviously my political philosophy is one of limited government. I do think there is an important role for government. We're obviously seeing that in this crisis year, but the value that really attracted people to Canada and still does to become Canadian is our belief in freedom. Whether it was the slaves who escaped the Underground Railway, the black loyalists, the refugees from the clearances, and in Scotland and in Ireland, the waves of refugees who have sought freedom, people who have sought economic freedom. Freedom has, I think, always been the guiding value of this country, and I am concerned, and I've said it before, I am concerned that we have been so willing to limit freedom so quickly in the COVID environment. I say that as the head of a government that has restricted freedoms, but my point is our approach has been to do that as a last and limited resort, not as a first and maximum resort. So I think we still have a greater emphasis on our belief in freedom here in Alberta, and I hope that will continue for a very long time to come. Crystal Tate says, will we tie the loosening of restrictions to the vaccination of at-risk populations? Well, we won't, Crystal, loosening, let me just put it this way. The progress in vaccinations will definitely be a factor, but it will be a more meaningful factor later on for 2 reasons. One, these are double dose vaccines. So even though we're very close to having vaccinated or administered a first dose to all of the folks in long-term care, it's not fully effective until they get their second dose, and that won't be for about another month. Secondly, we don't yet know whether the vaccine limits infectiousness, and the jury is out on that scientifically. If in fact it does limit infectiousness, I think that can help us to accelerate relaxations. But the main thing we're looking for on relaxation is reducing the pressure on the healthcare system. We have over 800 patients. Actually, I want to show those charts. I think you guys queued a couple up here for me. We have people ask, why did you put these restrictions in November and December? Well, let me show you. We have a chart that shows the growth in cases and then growth in hospitalizations. And I don't know if you guys can find that. But as I say, we were at a point in late November where the new cases were doubling every 2 weeks. And you can see you're getting up to the peak there in the first week of December. And then it starts to come down on the basis of the restrictions that we imposed in late November. And go to the hospital slide. This is, you can see here, that huge growth in the number of hospitalizations. The dark pink segment at the bottom is ICU, intensive care. The kind of orange is more general acute care admissions. And what we saw here was a 500% growth in COVID hospitalizations over the course of 1 month. So with cases doubling every 2 weeks, if we had not brought in those restrictions, the number of people being hospitalized would have gone from about 650 in early December to 1,300 to 2,600, and that would have totally cratered, frankly, the healthcare system. We would have had to cancel all non-urgent surgeries and non-urgent COVID care. So that kind of explains where we were at. And folks, we are not out of this yet. God, I wish that we were, but we still have like 830 people in hospital, which is higher than it was when we brought in those restrictions in late November, early December. And as I mentioned earlier tonight, very sadly, 38 lives lost to COVID in Alberta yesterday, the highest daily number yet. So I know this is painful, but we're not done yet. I'll go with our last question. Aman Sandhu says, hi, Kenney, happy Laurie. Oh, I didn't realize it was Laurie today. It's tomorrow. Okay. Well, happy Laurie to you as well. For those who don't know, Laurie is a very important festival in South Asia. When can we expect the vaccine to be available to the common man? Again, in the summer, I think, Aman, we'll be able to start moving to the general population regardless of age. So, all right, we've now taken 33 questions. We've been at this for well over an hour. Thank you very much for the good questions, folks, and I hope to be doing about one of these every week, schedule permitting. Stay safe out there. God bless.